Another thing that I've realized, which probably a lot of you here have realized, which is this space is insanely community driven. Like, I mean, we're all here, we're probably all in like a million of these Slack groups together. I think Ankur saw my Slack the other day. So why are you in so many Slack channels? I'm like, well, I'm just like seeing what's going on in the data ecosystem. I'm popping around. And you know, you've seen companies that have done this really well. And like, I talk to people, I will, you know, say this, and I am an investor in this company. I try to talk to like at least 5 data engineers a week. And I can't tell you the number of people who are like, oh my God, like I love Census. It's like the coolest thing I use. Like I was like top 50, or I was the first 50 users. And there's some sort of like clout to being one of the first 50 users. But you know, as there are more and more companies that are trying to do this and build their community, it can be a lot. And I'm kind of wondering how you guys have sort of thought about community, building your own communities, and how you try to keep authentic and real when there are so many kind of others out there trying to do the same.
Google like how to build a community. You'll get the kind of kumbaya stuff of like.
Can you send me the link? I'm trying to.
It's like be authentic. There was a reference that you sent around. It was this like David Sachs post. David Sachs is the former CEO of Yammer, so like I know the guy. That was about building a movement as a startup, and it's a lot of kind of same stuff, kind of slightly repackaged in his particular flavor. And I think there's actually an interesting lesson in this. It does not come from that post, but comes from David Sachs himself. So Sachs was like a somewhat prominent guy in Silicon Valley up until about a year ago, and then he became very prominent. And the reason he became prominent was not because he did these community building things, like he built a personal community and stuff around himself. Not because of that, it's because he said a bunch of incendiary shit. Like, yeah, you can say what you want about the actual things that he says. I don't agree with most of it, but fine. But the point is, like, he was provocative. And I think a lot of community building actually comes from just saying something that is provocative. Like, it gets the people going. And so, to me, like that, you can talk about community as this kind of like a happy thing of like all kind of use the word community is what it means. But really, a lot of it is like you're trying to attract people. It's just like say stuff that people will find interesting, because there's a lot of content out there about like listicles for the right way to do stuff and stuff like that. It doesn't get any attention. What gets attention is if you're out there doing that.
You have to differentiate audience from community. I think building an audience is that's for sure the way. Be controversial, 100%. Like that's the right way to do it. Someone got president just by doing that. So the community, I think, is about people being with each other and not related to you, the mouthpiece necessarily. So let's take current favorite community that people really, really love, which is Fishtown, right? And DBT. And that is about the opposite of that. I don't think Tristan's ever said anything controversial in his life. At least I think he'd be hard pressed to. I kind of wish he did. I would take the analogy from regular software. So I think what's going on in our field is very similar to what is this softwareification. And back in the 80s, Apple and Microsoft figured out that, hey, if you want people to build on our platform, you can't just market to them. You have to create this new role called developer evangelist. The idea was to proselytize the platform and what you could do with it, but more importantly, create like a way that engineers can help each other. And we now take for granted that Stack Overflow exists, which is very much about, again, it has its problems, but it's about developers helping each other. And that to me is community. That's when you've nailed it, is when they're helping each other. And data is exactly in that mode today where they are craving, like, how do I do stuff? How do I become better at what I do? My favorite thing is when I see, customers of ours who get promoted, and I can take credit if I want, but really it's about the people that have influenced them to be able to do more in their job. And a lot of that comes out of these communities. The difference between being controversial and building an audience and having a community is that they help each other more than they care about you.
Now, Mark, I think this is an interesting question for you, because when you were at Lyft, you built a very large community around Amundsen, and then went off and built this company. So I'm curious, like, how do you think about that community in Stemma? Is it the same? Is it separate?
It's very important that we as a company don't over commercialize that community, but also one thing that I have learned over the last few years is that you don't choose your community chooses you. For us, like there's like multiple personas that interact with the product, and we often think about like, oh, should we bring in like these kinds of people in our community or not? It's just like the critical mass that's there, it's much easier for people to just gather with the same crowd. And then the second thing that I often think about is, do you have a developer community or a user community? And this is something that I borrowed from Cloudera. Like Hadoop, for example, had a really good developer community and a really good user community, but those are two separate communities. One is contributing code to your project, and the other one is simply using that project. And the way to build and groom and grow those communities is actually slightly different. And the cost you pay to maintain those communities is also vastly different. So if you are ever thinking about building a community around your product, like think deeply about what community do you have easier access to, and what kind of community are you trying to build? Are you trying to contribute them to your software, say if you're an open source project, or you're just trying to do a user community?
A lot of people, community is kind of buzzwordy. Like every product is now a platform. Every customer base is not a community. Like there's a lot of people who will say, this is our community of users. It's just customers. Like there's a big difference between what DBT and Fishtown is doing and what most people refer to as their community of customers, which is customers who complain to them, but they then tell them their community told them they wanted something.